Hello, and welcome to tonight's talk by the Dean of the School of Media, Arts and Humanities, Professor Kate O'Riordan. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, a dynamic and engaging programme of talks, events and activities. The festival is produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts and Humanities at Sussex University. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the Sussex Festival of Ideas website after the festival. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We welcome your questions and comments via the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen, and we'll respond to these throughout. This is very much meant to be a dialogue and a question and answer occasion to respond to Kate's pre-recorded talk. A member of the festival's team might contact webinar attendees for their feedback after the event. If you do not wish to be contacted, please email the festival's producer or a member of the festival team to opt out of these communications. You can find the contact details on the Sussex Festival of Ideas website. At this point, it's my pleasure to hand to Ed Hughes, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, Margaretta. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be in the chair this evening, following 4 days of absolutely amazing events in the Sussex Festival of Ideas, first edition. And as Margaretta said, we have had the chance to enjoy Kate's talk, and that's still available online on the website for people to continue to enjoy. And the event this evening is about responding to her ideas and taking it in the context of the brilliant festival that we have just been privileged to enjoy. So I want to turn to Kate, who is our Dean of the School of Media, Arts and Humanities at the University of Sussex. And just to begin by saying thanks very much for your brilliant talk with its breathtaking range and vision of media, arts and humanities as a global force for good, actively intervening in the world. I wondered whether you would like to just recap some of your main themes, 2 or 3 main themes briefly, just in case there's anyone who's actually joining us now who may then wish to catch up with your talk later.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ed, and thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to be part of the festival. In the talk, I talked about the festival itself and the way that we imagine the festival as a way for students, alumni and staff to work across the new school. And I think it's also been a really great opportunity to showcase work to each other as a community. So it's about connecting across the school, across the community of scholars, staff, students, alumni, but also connecting with institutions externally, partners and other organisations. And I think at the centre of that is, in essence, a form of community building, connectivity, and opening up to thinking about the different disciplines in these areas and the ways in which we are ready and could also have potential to work together in the future. So I talked a bit about that, kind of the idea of the festival as developing communities of practice, developing community and bringing together elements across the school. And the kind of importance of thinking about the range of different interventions across media, arts and humanities, and to think about inclusion as a really important principle, and also to think about the strengths of the school and these kinds of areas in terms of creative and critical practice, in terms of experimental modes of knowledge production, and thinking about ways in which there is an important political agenda that cuts across really the ecological kind of world and climate crisis, politics, corporations and nationalism, and the human subject and technology. And those 3 strands of thinking about ecology, politics and people were the basis for the themes to kind of lay out a political agenda for intervention. And around that, I was really making the argument that interdisciplinarity and an experimental disposition are really crucial in achieving that kind of inclusiveness, that sharing of practice, that kind of opening up of spaces for knowledge production that are accessible and inclusive in ways that really connect across different kinds of community and avoid that kind of moving into different sort of silos or institutions, or ways in which kind of knowledges and communities can be fragmented. And I was making those arguments in the context of a time in which it's very difficult to work in these subject areas because of a number of different forces that are coming into play, challenges around funding, crises around kind of knowledge production, crises in higher education themselves, and also clearly coming through a pandemic, and coming through one of the most difficult times we kind of collectively have experienced, and the evisceration of live performance, of opportunities to come together, and those elements all kind of underpinning the experience of students, staff and institutions, particularly cultural and creative institutions in this moment. And I then went on to really talk about the way that media, arts and humanities are important sites of making intervention and materialization in the world, and that they make knowledge, they make artifacts, they make practices, they make community, and they make realities. And that for me is the really crucial thing to think about right now, is that the conditions of the possible futures, the ways in which we might be moving kind of forward as communities, at global kind of levels, and also local and individual levels, are really about kind of futures that are in the making. And media, arts and humanities have this really, really strong and powerful capacity to make those futures, to make those realities, to bring things into being in the world. And I think sometimes that can be underestimated, the degree to which mediation, mediatization is part of the conditions of the reality in which we live, not a kind of symbolic or separate form or a way in which the reality is communicated to audiences. Mediatization, and I mean all kind of cultural forms that we can think of as media forms, are core to how we understand, shape and materialize things in the world. And that's where it's really important to have a kind of collective and inclusive vision to think about how best to intervene. And I talked about a particular example drawn from my own work, which was thinking about the way in which new technologies are bringing different materialities into being. And I talked particularly around de-extinction projects, where the kind of through biotechnological practices and imaginaries, previously extinct species are kind of understood to be being brought back into the world. And I talked about the central role of mediation in understanding, imagining, or even thinking about what that might mean and how that might happen. So I use that example as one which I think is quite powerful to help articulate my point, which is that media makes materialities and media makes realities, and that what we collectively do and make will underpin and shape the futures that both for ourselves and for kind of generations to come. And it's really important to think about those kind of roles that these areas have. And connecting across all of that is this really important aspect of interdisciplinarity, which is inherent to media, arts and humanities anyway, as subject areas. They are interdisciplinarity is part of the field itself, but also is really important to think about working across other disciplinary areas with sciences, social sciences, politics, and other areas, and other disciplinary areas, but also other institutions and other communities of practice that are also not integral to HE itself. And that's where I think both inclusion and interdisciplinarity come together and are really important. So I talked about media, arts and humanities being part of the kind of conditions, the possible conditions of all the kind of futures that we're thinking about, with those three core themes around ecology, around politics, and around the human subject itself.
Thanks, Kate. Oh, sorry, carry on.
No, that's fine.
I want to say, first of all, that with me in the virtual room also are Margareta Jolly and Mary Agnes Crowell. Mary is the artistic director of the festival, and Margareta has been key in working on our keynote speakers. And it's fantastic to have those colleagues with us. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions, if I may, to you, Kate, and then I'll see whether Margaretta and Mary have some too. And at the same time, please do, if you are watching online, please do contribute any questions you would like to through the Q&A function that Margaretta mentioned earlier, and we will definitely get to those too. So thanks very much. Kate, the festival, I think, has been really almost not surprised us all, but has delighted all of us on the team by being, I think, to some extent, in the spirit of the sense of how essential the humanities are. We've had so many fascinating and provocative events, from the theory of hyperobjects and coronavirus to the practice of drone music across different countries simultaneously. And also for me, I was quite struck by a number of sessions. For example, the really interesting sessions by Sussex Writes and on Rave Today. I was struck with the fact that these were co-produced with undergraduate students and also with research students. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts yourself on how important you think the student voice is in shaping how universities intervene, through the media arts and humanities.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. That has been really great. And I think that's one of the really strong contributions of the festival, actually, is the way that it has worked across both staff and students in different ways through the production of the festival itself and through the kind of projects and practices that we've seen throughout the programme. And I think that's helped to underscore what is behind the question anyway, which is exactly the importance of that voice. So universities are centrally about students and staff, and they're centrally about students and staff working together. And there are some forces which actually, although it's counterintuitive, put obstacles in the path of that happening. And the teaching and learning space is the kind of can be a kind of ideal forum for that. And I think there are ways in which colleagues in the school, and that's demonstrated across the festival, have really worked to those strengths. And I think seeing the festival team also work with that has been really, really positive. At the same time, it's really difficult, and it actually there's a lot of work that needs to go into creating spaces that do work productively in that way and aren't that resist the possibility for people having different priorities and sort of playing some of that off. So this vision of students and staff working together, collaborating creatively, but also co-working on what it really means to be in media arts and humanities at this time is really crucial. And I think what we need to do is create spaces and frameworks that enables that, because students come to Sussex to leave Sussex. So they're not here as part of creating the infrastructure and the framework. They come to leave, and they have their own priorities. And we really have to work with students to understand what are the frameworks that they want to engage with and can engage with, and that support them to have a sense of duration, connection to other generations of students, and connection to staff and current students while they're here and before they come here and after they leave as well. So that partnership, I think, is crucial. I also think that our students, probably at this point in time, more than ever, can be very powerful at articulating why media arts and humanities are important in the world. And the immersion in mediatized structures and a kind of media life is something that many of our students will have grown up with, and that's having a sense of the world as already always transformed and configured by media forces, by mediatization, by representation of all different kinds, I think is possibly stronger for our students than it may have been for some other generations, because mediatization has become such a force in the world and is so much part of the kind of everyday fabric of our lives. And the pandemic's exacerbated that and kind of made that clearer in different ways. So they also, what our students understand by media arts and humanities is also something that's different from many of the ways that staff would understand that. So coming together in projects where we can create language that we both understand and establish clear structures where we can participate together, I think is really, really crucial and central to the school. And this first year of the school, working with Student Advisory Board and really trying to kind of bring students and staff kind of working together as part of the central force of the school is really crucial and something that we definitely need to build on and get advice from our students about what's worked for them in that process and help build that into succession and future planning for the school and for the festival.
Thank you very much. And there have also been some wonderful observations through the course of the festival around thinking about decolonisation, for example, in this afternoon session at 3 o'clock, when we actually had some really interesting external speakers who are actually reflecting on the role of museums, in fact. But it was really interesting because it reached into education, and there was some really powerful food for thought there in terms of moving from, I think the expression was from passive approaches to empowered approaches to learning too. So it's a really exciting time to be working on this at the moment. We've got a question in the chat, in the Q&A, which I'm going to do first, and then I will turn to Margaretta. So first of all, here's a question from which is, what role does the University Arts Centre have to play in your vision for media arts and humanities at the University of Sussex?
That's really, again, a really crucial role. I think the Arts Centre, the Attenborough Centre for I think the Attenborough Centre is a huge asset, and it works really well as a university arts centre. It's foundational to the original vision of Sussex, I think, which is to kind of bring together arts and sciences in outward facing ways that enable community both to somewhere to bring people to, but also something that speaks out to kind of broader communities. And the ACA has done fantastic work on external engagement and co-programming with external organisations and other producers and companies across the region. And it's also a hugely attractive place for students themselves on campus as well as staff. And I think the university needs a strong arts and culture sensitivity and strategy, and I think the ACA is at the heart of that. And I think different schools working across the university with the ACA as a hub is the way forward about thinking around that. And I think media arts and humanities, obviously, as a school, has a particular kind of relationship there, but it's also a way to bring students and community across different areas of the university at the same time.
Thank you. And I'd add to that also, of course, the festival itself has been working really successfully with the ACA as a partner throughout the last 4 or 5 days, and it's been an absolutely fantastic experience working with them. I'm going to turn to Margaretta, who, along with Mary Agnes Quell, is in the Zoom room with us, to see if Margaretta's got a question, and then I'll move to Michael O'Connell, who's got a question. Thanks, Margaretta.
Thank you. Well, I have lots of questions. I'm struggling to pick, but I think I'll ask a question that stays a little bit with the question around the purpose of media and arts and humanities and interdisciplinarity, in part because I can see the next question coming up in the Q&A is on that topic. And I'll save my burning questions about charismatic animals and mammoths, although we will get to them. So the question, building on your very compelling and I think probably heartwarming vision of reconnecting the arts and the sciences and refinding maybe a Sussex tradition that was all about, well, as Asa Briggs described it, a new map of learning, which still seems to be needed. Early 1960s, we're still struggling to really fully realize that connection. And I think your point about the experimental humanities is enabling that was very wonderful. But my question is around again how to materialize this, in that I think it's a lot easier at the research level and here you are, you with your wonderful imagination going and putting together all these things in a great cooking pot. But to do it at degree level and to translate it in a way that I think, going back to what students might want, is another question. And so my question is how to get the interdisciplinary vision, particularly as it's around the experimental humanities, how to get it to talk to the structures of school A levels, the kinds of expectations maybe a 17-year-old would have when they're looking on a curriculum and they want to know what it is they're getting. How do we make it work for undergraduates, and for how we have to put together a degree in a translatable form?
Yeah, thanks, Margareta. There's a lot there. I think there are different ways of thinking about that. So I think the way that we are engaging with and speaking to students who might be coming to Sussex is crucial. And at the same time, that what we're then doing at Sussex is something slightly different. You can't do the journey of 3 years of kind of working in somewhere like Sussex directly. You can't put that straight into the language that you're talking to sixth form students or people who are not really thinking about the university context, who at the point that you're engaging with them. So I think we need to find ways to really communicate accessibly what it is that we offer and what it is that we do. And that's slightly different from how do we do it. So I think there are two pieces there, and I'll leave the kind of how do we communicate more successfully in a more inclusive way to kind of bring people to the table with, and then think about the question of kind of what do you do when you've got people around the table. And I think it comes back to what we've already been talking about. One of the questions is actually about genuinely being in conversation about what's important to students and what they want to get out of university education, and we need to work with that. I mean, I've got a couple of examples of kind of how to build into the curriculum, if you like. I think one of my most positive teaching experiences at Sussex was when I used to teach an undergraduate module called Science and the Media, and it was open to both biology students and media students, and both groups found it challenging in different ways, because it did mean that you had to kind of think about challenge to your area, but it also had a clear offer to students from different constituents as well. And it did enable much more interdisciplinary kind of project kind of creation within the course itself. And that, I think, creating ways in which students from different constituents can see what they would get out of an interdisciplinary offering is really crucial. And this does tie into also how do we articulate accessibly what it is that we think is the potential and the kind of offer there. And I think I do think kind of arts and technology sit together in ways that enable access across the board, I think, really. When I think back on kind of some of the earlier curriculum, and I think when we're talking about kind of traditions that Sussex might be built on and putting art and science together, I think one of the important things to recognise is that you have to constantly remake. You have to constantly rebuild and remake. And that's perhaps what we haven't been as good at doing. It's not that we've kind of lost the sense of the sort of traditional direction, but we have perhaps lost a sense that you constantly have to remake and renew how you're working and what you're working with. And it's challenging to do that. But you can think about all the ways in which arts, technologies and sciences really strongly connect to each other and can really be part of an undergraduate curriculum that works if you keep coming back to an attention to that project and think about modules like IT and society and kind of older versions of those, but science and the media again would be an obvious one for me, but lots of work around particularly computing and arts, creative arts and computing, robot operas. Those aren't things that only speak to research. I think those are things which really speak to actually a much broader sense of kind of real world challenges and problems, and I think in some ways less arcane and more accessible than some other modes that we engage in. So I think we could be more attentive to the question and to the redoing of it. But I think we have it there. What we're less skilled at perhaps is articulating that in an accessible way that makes sense to people coming into the university at this point.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Kate and Margaretta. Just sort of staying with that a little bit, it's just making me think that it's quite easy for individual schools in universities and individual universities to feel quite embattled, and with good reason quite often. But thinking beyond the School of Media Arts and Humanities for a moment, and thinking also about Sussex being founded on the principle that arts and sciences should work together, do you see an urgency for universities to work collectively together in the world? I mean, given the crisis you've identified, because it's so easy to be in a position where you're, because it's a market economy, even in the university world, is there an urgency around collective working to address the crises in ecology and in infrastructure and networks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can restate that they're global challenges. If we're in a global ecology, you can partition things as much as you like, but to go back to one of the kind of figures that I quite like it in when we think about things like sharing air, for example, or sharing water, or sharing resources that you really can't partition off. There is a sense of the ways in which you have to understand concerns operating very differently in different locations, but also being very connected across countries, across continents, across different areas. I think working with other universities in the UK context is important in relation to the politics of higher education and education in Britain, and we also have to be able to think about that in a broader context and think about connections with Europe, even though I know that seems difficult right now, but actually it's even more important because of the kind of new barriers that are arising, but also more in that kind of broader range, and thinking about relationships with universities in Hong Kong, in China, in the US, in different parts of the African continent. I think that's really, really important, and it helps to kind of take us away from the slightly sort of myopic kind of the crises of the kind of particular local politics, because local politics do change and global politics also give us that broader horizon and sense of both continuity and difference, I think. And thinking about relationships with University of California, Santa Cruz, or China University of Hong Kong, and other institutions where we've worked with people over time, and also potential new partnerships with, for example, Iceland University of the Arts, or other areas where we might think about a strong connection, is absolutely vital, because we need both that defamiliarization and sense of community globally, as well as the resilience to work in our own kind of local or more local national politics.
Thanks very much. I'm going to turn to Mihal's question, which is on interdisciplinarity, and then I'll check in with Mary Agnes-Krell, who's our artistic director, to see if she's got a response to your talk. So first of all, Mihal's question. Mihal, I'm going to take a liberty and say that I enjoyed your presentation in the Creative Practice Symposium this morning in the ACCA, and I liked the quote that you had from Tom Paulin a lot, in which he said, "I think ideas should be flying around and banging into each other, and if you occupy a static position, things ossify." I like that so much I wrote it down. So Mihal, here's your question, which is kind of a little bit critical. It's really interesting. As well as interdisciplinarity, implying people from different arenas working together in ways which emphasize agreement and consensus, presumably agonism and argumentation are important. Can there be a value in long-standing tensions between realms, such as art and science?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, I think interdisciplinarity is at its strongest when it challenges. And one of the reasons why it's quite difficult to actually carry through meaningfully over time is that that in its best and strongest sense, it fundamentally challenges the disciplines that engage in interdisciplinary work, and that is really valuable and productive and really difficult. And you often see art and science projects either collapse or become sort of illustrative or kind of sort of coexisting in a way that's quite bland if they don't have that kind of underpinning challenge. And you have to find ways of working that enable people who fundamentally disagree and who don't want to be challenged, or who are going to constantly question each other's expertise, to be able to find ways of working together. And I think that's the things that I've kind of learned about art and science endeavors over the years, is that the ones that really change things are the ones that fundamentally challenge the disciplines from which they come, and actually are critical in ways which are very difficult for practitioners. And people who manage to still talk to each other across those tensions, I think, are where you see some of the most kind of productive and most interesting work that can actually sort of help really actually change things, rather than simply repeat, reproduce, or illustrate. And that's the sort of danger of interdisciplinary projects, is that you kind of stay in your own zones of comfort and basically kind of leverage your kind of cultural capital to get funding, that, and yeah, that can work, but it doesn't really change things fundamentally. And I think that precisely that criticality and that agonism is really important and simultaneously really difficult, because people don't like it, and working with that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges there is.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. I think it's the question of risks as well as the opportunities around interdisciplinarity and experimentalism. It's really fantastic that you've articulated those, because I think it helps us to move forward. So there's a question that's come in from Evelyn, which I will get to shortly, but I just wanted to ask Mary if you'd like to come in and present a response or a question. Mary.
I'll just say briefly, so I cannot fathom that I have ended up being the artistic director of this inaugural Festival of Ideas. It is tremendous and it's an honor, and I feel overwhelmed by how happy I am at the opportunities I've had to get to know people right across the School of Media Arts and Humanities, and the opportunities I've had to come to truly understand the diverse and wide and deep range of work that we produce. And I found myself realizing this week something that I thought was a kind of Sussex quality, and I might be wrong, but I would like to hope it could be a quality of our school, and I'd like to ask what Kate thinks about this, is that when I arrived at Sussex, I had this understanding that it was a kind of flat place. So you could be professional services, or a student, or somebody mowing the lawn, or a professor, but we could speak to each other. And so in building the festival, and Ed will tell you that this is how I work, I kind of kept repeating that I see the festival and the work that we produce as a kind of conduit to help people connect with each other and to help people connect with us as a school. And I know that might sound a bit silly or hopeful, and I get accused of being an optimist all the time, and maybe that's what's helped me get through this year. But Kate, do you think that there's space for that kind of hope, that we could, as a school or as a field, find a space to connect with each other on the same level or on the same playing field? Because part of me hopes or thinks that I've seen some of that already in these events where students and faculty have been working together, or students have created something like the road trip radio podcasts, and faculty and staff and students have taken part. Do you think there's space for that as we kind of build this vision of the school? And if you don't, I'm so sorry to ask this, I feel horrible. Could you tell me what I'm getting wrong, or what I don't see about what's problematic about that view? I'm so sorry about this question.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. And that's also been one of my experiences of Sussex is actually the possibility of working really closely with students, professional services staff, technical staff, people in different areas, and even across really different parts of the kind of estate, thinking right through to, I mean, the interesting thing about Sussex is that as a campus university, it's also an estate. So it's also a set of buildings, it's a set of residences, people live here. There's people that work in multiple different ways. And we're all part of the university. And at the same time, academic hierarchies work in such ways that, by and large, professors are the most visible part of the kind of the institution in many ways, or the kind of academic element is the most visible. So yeah, a lot of the time, and for totally reasons that make sense. However, I do think it is important to come back to this question about accessibility and inclusion, because it has to be, what we do has to be meaningful across the board and across the whole community at Sussex, as well as communities that we might work with in other places. And I think the idea of when there isn't an even playing field, people have different conditions, they have different contract conditions, there are different hierarchies, there are different power relations at play, and we can't just imagine those away, although it'd be nice to. But we have to, if we can recognize them, acknowledge them, and work with them, I think that does that goes a long way into kind of doing that. And then the only way that you can do that is by modeling and through practice, and by showing people that that's a good way of working, and showing positive outcomes from working like that. And it does feel like the festival has been a good space for that, and different ways of working around exhibition and practice can be really good ways of working with that, because everyone in a team that comes together to produce something is part of that team. And we do some of that in kind of focusing on group work, even though that's really challenging in a teaching and learning environment. So I mean, I'd share your hope for that, and sometimes that has been my experience of Sussex. And again, I'd come back to this imperative that we have to continue to reattend and to remake and to redo the work of connection all of the time. It's never a done thing. It's in process, and it's in the making of it, and finding ways to do that are important, and again, really challenging. So we can't, I don't think we can level playing fields, but we can try and reduce obstacles, and we can try and acknowledge and make visible those obstacles and find ways of working across them.
Thank you, Kate and Mary. Brilliant question, brilliant answer. So Evelyn Ficara has a question. I'm going to read it out. It's quite a really reflective and interesting question, and also a little bit political at the end. So thank you very much for a challenging and inspiring keynote. Your view of media arts and humanities as ways of knowing are very rich, as are notions of the experimental and of listening. I wonder if there is also value in unknowing and not knowing. For example, we may need to unknow ways we've been taught to do things in order to find out what's really going on or discover new things. We may need to accept that we don't fully know another person's or group's experience. Is it possible to talk about valuing ambiguity and not knowing in the current education climate? Or are we bound by the necessity of producing results, outputs, and new knowledge?
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot in that question. And I don't know if I'll be able to kind of fully do it justice. And it's interesting because when I was thinking about some of the risks of the experimental, some of the risks of the experimental are a commitment to not knowing, and to the unknown, and to the untested. And the opposite of that is the tested, the known, and thinking about the value of that is important. And it's important not to conflate experimental with innovative. Because it's not always about newness, it's not always about untestedness. It can be about remaking, renewing, and historical, a sense of the historical is really, really crucial. But for me, an experimental mode does have a commitment to the unknown, and it does have a commitment to the sense that you can't fully have that comprehension. And also, for me, that connects to interdisciplinarity as well, because you need people who understand things differently and who have different experiences, and you have to have a sense of trust, I think, that connection, working together, kind of contact zones of practice will enable some forms of opening up and some forms of knowing. But there is no full knowledge of others. There's no full knowledge of other beings. There's no full knowledge even of ourselves. And that is an important aspect to the whole politics of knowledge production. And there is, of course, an imperative in academic knowledge production to produce the known and to make claims about knowledge. And I think, and this might be trying to have it both ways, I think you can do both. I think you can make a claim to knowledge, and I think the really important thing about any knowledge claim is that you're transparent about the apparatus of thinking that enables you to think that way, and you're then obliged to demonstrate to other people how it is you come to think that way. But that works in reverse as well, because it enables you to engage with other people's thinking, and that sense of the degrees of unknowability, I think probably that remains more strongly within academic practice. And I was thinking about this working with scientists, that scientists are often sort of herded into making claims about knowledge because of particular kinds of funding regimes or particular expectations by government and policy about having answers. But science, like most areas of knowledge production, is always about not knowing, and about always being proved wrong until next time. And there's that kind of that going through different kinds of forms of knowledge production, and you lose and you forget and you unknow, and those are all really important challenges. So I think for me, I don't see a contradiction in that, but I know I'm quite good at bridging constitutive contradictions, but then I think they're productive, and I think they're precisely kind of productive around these kinds of questions. And I think the limits of knowledge and the limits of knowability, and also some kind of humility around knowledge claiming is really crucial. And we are tied into a structure of outputs and so on, but fortunately within our fields, at least at this point in time, those outputs still can open up questions rather than be compelled to provide answers. And we still have forms of recognition that it's actually the questions that are more important within media arts and humanities particularly. And I think holding on to that within these areas is crucial. So I don't know if that is really an answer, but that is how I would answer.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's really, I was quite drawn to what you were saying, because it was a form of inclusion, it seemed to me, especially with your reference to history and the experimental. That was really interesting. I'm going to pass now to Margareta.
Kate, I would love to keep thinking about disciplines and knowledge and philosophy, but I really want, before we run out of time, to hear a bit more about the mammoths, because this was a very important part of your talk, and I think it brought to life many of these quite abstract debates. Your point being the mammoth explains, you used it to demonstrate your point about media as world making and having a material effect. And I just thought if you could very briefly recap that, but then, if I may be so bold, go on to mushrooms and fungi, which you didn't talk about, but which are have become a charismatic, against all expectations, a rather charismatic plant form. And Natalia Ciceri, who's in our school, whose book you cited, she's working very much in this area of why it's become so. I would love to hear your thoughts on the mushroom after the mammoth.
Thanks, Margareta. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and this also kind of links to one of the earlier talks actually around hyperobjects and kind of mammoth things in the world, to use mammoth in that way. Although I think it's Jefferson who used mammoth for the first time as an adjective rather than animal to describe kind of huge things in the world. And mammoths they could be thought of as a kind of hyperobject, I think, in some ways. But essentially, for me, talking about the mammoth was a way of actually, trying to put in an example that does start to concretize some of the kind of abstract, essentially very abstract things I'm talking about. And that comes, for me, the de-extinction projects promise to materialize new beings in the world, and they're both kind of fascinating and slightly horrific at the same time. And the use of the term necrofauna, I think, is quite an interesting one in terms of conjuring both that kind of horror and that promise, because they're still charismatic, but the kind of the whole, the nexus of de-extinction for me is just really fascinating in many ways. But one of them is this promise to kind of bring new beings into the world, to inaugurate in the world, which is also something that we do in terms of media practices, we do in terms of knowledge production. The thing about the mammoth, I guess, that holds it together for me is that, no one's ever seen a mammoth. They've never been filmed, they've never been recorded, they've never been photographed. We have got drawings from the caves of the mammoths, and they're simultaneously one of the earliest visual representations that we know of, and also completely unknown in the sense that no one living has seen one. But we think we have this kind of mode of witnessing from the illustrations from the cave of the mammoths, but we don't know that those are forms of witness. Actually, they're also different kind of art forms that we don't have the tools to understand the cultures in which they're produced. So the thing that comes back to me with mammoths really is that genetic science kind of promises the creation of genomes of extinct species, and that the creation of those genomes will then lead to the creation of the organisms. And at the same time, genomes don't produce the way that organisms look. And I guess that was, for me, the interesting thing, because when we think about other de-extinction projects and histories, you often have animals that don't look like the extinct animal, and therefore are not recognized. And at the time, we're not recognized. And this also connects to Jim Mendersby's work, actually works on kind of looking at some of these questions. And the example of the quagga is an interesting one, because at some points in time, this extinct animal existed, but it no longer looked like a quagga, so it wasn't recognized as one. But probably quaggas that didn't look like quaggas had closer genomes to other versions. They look a bit like zebras or horses. And the thing about the mammoth is that you would have to tinker around with its genome so that it expressed the features that we visually connect with mammoths in order for it to be a successful mammoth. Because if you had something that looked like an Asian elephant and you said it was a mammoth because its genome was a mammoth genome, that would have, of course, scientific salience and be really interesting for scientists, but it would not achieve the de-extinction project. It would, introducing Asian elephants to the tundra isn't the project. If that was the project, you could just do it. So the mammoths would have to look like mammoths, and all of our ideas about how mammoths look is built up over this kind of visual culture and is inspired by these highly technical media forms. And when you think about any capacity to organize something in the world, you start to see how it would have to be through some sort of mimetic lens, which we already know. And that goes back to Evelyn's question about the knowable, because in a way we have structures that determine futures that are already knowable, because we've already seen them. And that was where I was kind of trying to get to with the mammoth. I don't know that I can segue into mushrooms. But the turn of the mushroom as a charismatic and also as a kind of hyper object in the world, I think makes sense because of thinking about ecology, and it's been a central dimension to kind of ecological thinking for for a long time, and I can see how that kind of opens up. And also Anna Zing's amazing work on fungi made that a kind of a story of global kind of connection and friction. And mammoths are, in a way, well, de-extinction more broadly is, I think, because almost all countries have a de-extinction candidate, which also kind of speaks to sort of national connections to big science projects. But that's yeah, that's a loose set of connections.
Thanks.
Thank you. So just sort of for a moment, loosely staying with the notion of the technical and the artisanal and how that connects so brilliantly to the urgency and the importance of the crucial importance of media, arts and humanities in the world. I was quite interested in your reference to Warren Sack and the software arts, and also to University of California, Santa Cruz. I know that you have a personal connection with that university, but so I was intrigued. Well, two things really here. I think one is just whether you've got anything you could sort of talk a little bit further about the importance of Warren Sack's work in kind of almost flipping our assumptions about the value of the contribution of computing and where that sits, as it were, in the arts and sciences. And secondly, if you've got any further thoughts about why you see universities like Santa Cruz as sister institutions, why they resonate and connect with our mission.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I think Warren's work's really important in precisely doing that flipping. So it brings art into the centre of science, and it brings the artisanal, the technical, the practice, the experiential together with art practice, and it brings dimensions that cut across art and science, that don't reiterate and kind of go back into this largely rhetorical separation, and highlights actually the connecting tissues and structures in ways that I think is faithful to both art and science. And I think that's really important. So I think the kind of rhetorical demand that art and science be separated is damaging and has been repeated over well over 100 years now, and it is a rhetorical flourish, and it is often linked to politics and funding. And actually the practices of the arts and sciences across different areas have much more connection than they have disconnection. And Warren's work's really valuable in pulling that through in a kind of really quite deep and scholarly way. And I think, Thor's work also kind of connects there. And I think of, Thor and Warren's work as, connecting well across the two institutions. So yeah, so anyone who's listening to this, I would recommend reading The Software Arts as well as Sonic Writing for ways of thinking about how art and science are actually, more connected than disconnected, and that's crucial. Santa Cruz also, just as an institution, I've got strong connections there. I had a part post there for many years, and I've taught with colleagues there, and have organised for colleagues from Sussex to go there and to come back and forth. But I was just the latest iteration in a tradition that's gone on for the length of the two universities. So LGBT students back and forth around AIDS activism was a really important part of the history of both institutions. They're both kind of built around sort of quasi-democratizing versions of Oxford at the same sort of time into these kind of, they're also in national parks, they're also in biospheres. They also have a commitment to art and science connecting, and have done that in really interesting ways. And their digital art and new media program, for example, brings together computing and fine arts in really successful ways, and has had periods of extraordinary kind of generativity, I suppose. And we're thinking about acoustic ecology and music and film and all of those connections, and social justice cutting across both institutions as well. So that's a kind of potted history, but there's a huge and deep history of connection between the two institutions.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's really, really helpful to understand that. Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. We're going to finish around 7:30. We have one more question from the Q&A, which is great. But first, I wanted to turn to Margareta to see if you've got a further question. Margareta.
Okay, well, maybe be brief, even though this is another huge question. So this is about the word humanism. and humanities, because much of your work is about questioning, I think, the older versions of that. And you do talk a lot about what it means to be human. So what would you like to see the humanities do around the term human?
I think I would like the humanities to articulate the human as relational. And I think it has a powerful capacity to do that, and already does that in many ways. And it already decenters the human within the humanities. And I think that decentering and that relationality of human, mushrooms, trees, animals, mammals, biospheres, air, is crucial in terms of giving us that broader horizon to think about human politics.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so the final question for our session today is from Jessica Horn, who is a postgraduate researcher and also our fantastic festival producer, and we would be nowhere without her. So her question is, thank you for this session. What a wonderful way to end the inaugural festival. Kate, what hopes do you have for the festival in future years?
Thank you. And yeah, thank you to Jessica as well for all of your work with, the festival couldn't have happened without you. For me, it's the beginning, I think. I think it takes years to build kind of strong, meaningful, kind of purposeful connection and community. And a festival is something to be repeated, it's something to be built on, it's something to, it's always a year's work putting together a festival, and the festival starts as soon as it stops. And I think building the festival into the work of the school and embedding it and having it sit into teaching and research and administration as part of the culture of the school is really important. So I think what I would like for the festival is that it's an ongoing process, that we set up the structures for it to be an ongoing process, and we embed it really strongly in the school, and we use it as the kind of core engine really for some of our strong aims, particularly around working in collaboration across different groups and building a really strong platform that is about connecting within the university and also connecting outside of the university, and thinking about all the different communities, from people who might come to the university for whatever reason, who are at the university and who have been at the university, and bringing that through. So for me, it's the beginning. It's essentially the beginning, and it's been a really fantastic beginning. It inaugurates something. It's helped inaugurate the school itself, and yeah, it's kind of the beginning of something which has been great in its own right, and is an ongoing thing. For me, it's kind of a live thing that needs to be part of the school.
Kate, thank you so much. It's been incredibly inspiring to hear your talk, which remains online on the page, which is great, so people can still hear it. And through this question and answer, to get more richness and understanding of your vision for the new School of Media Arts and Humanities, including its purpose and broader reach, as well as a really strong sense of your personal philosophy and thought. So, agreeing with Jessica again, I can't think of a better way than this to conclude the festival. If I may, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the whole team. Everyone involved has been brilliant, and it's been a real highlight and a pleasure to work with everyone who's been involved in this. Partnerships, some amazing connections being forged in the community, in the region and nationally. The Keynote's work has been fantastic. The creative practice has been fantastic. Working with the Attenborough Centre for Creative Arts has been a complete pleasure, and all sorts of extraordinary technical solutions have been achieved in the last few days. But most importantly, it feels like it's been a moment to come together and to increase our understanding of the world and ourselves through this intense, few days. So a special thank you to festival producer Jessica Horn and to artistic director Mary Krell, who have both worked tirelessly to deliver these events. Thank you to both of those people at this point. But to conclude once again, Kate, thank you so much for the fascinating insights into theory and your vision for practices which synthesize theory and practice and argue for the centrality of the arts, humanities, media, and communication in producing a better world for everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attending, and that concludes our session today.
Thank you.